We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for a political, economic, and social alternative.
It's actually Stalinism itself that has prevented so many people from drawing the same conclusions that Lenin drew.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. We discuss pressing issues, highlight current events and active struggles, answer questions, and we bring the lessons of history to the present day. World to Win is hosted by the International Socialist Alternative, an organization made up of sections in more than 30 countries and existing on every continent. We don't just make this show. We're actively organizing in workplaces and communities every day. We're living in an era of one crisis tumbling right into the next. A deadly pandemic into a global depression.
This is a far more serious crisis for their system than that.
A global depression into potential climate chaos. Yet, at the same time, we're witnessing a momentous return of the labor movement, of workplace organizing, with more people getting up and getting involved every day.
Tens of thousands of people are going out to protest every week.
We need to rise to meet these new challenges. Tune in every Sunday to hear socialists from across the world talk about what's happening now and where to go next. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!
Welcome back to World to Win. Sorry to all of our viewers, we took last week off, but we're back again with an exciting episode about what's going on right now in Hong Kong. We have three amazing guest speakers with us today about the events, to talk about the events, and as always, there will be time for you to ask questions. So make sure you get your questions ready and put them in the comments. So we have Vincent here with us in studio today. How's it going, Vincent? And we will also hear from Pasha and Jacko later. The situation happening right now in Hong Kong is rapidly changing and important for all workers globally to be aware of. And for that reason, please share this stream on your social media so we can get everyone informed and involved with this very, very important conversation. Today, we're going to discuss the new national security law that's passing and a draconian crackdown on democratic rights in Hong Kong by the Chinese regime. So I want to go right to Vincent. What can you tell us why this is happening right now, Vincent?
Well, I think the reason is that the CCP dictatorship, the so-called Communist Party in China, is extremely worried. They're facing an unprecedented crisis, which perhaps with all the other crises in the world at the present time is not so visible in a lot of cases. It's perhaps going under the radar, but there is a huge crisis in China in terms of the economy, in terms of unemployment, which has exploded as a result of the international crisis and the pandemic, of course. So these are the reasons why the Chinese regime has acted to carry out this crackdown at the present time. We're living in a period of revolution and counter-revolution, and this is certainly what we're seeing in Hong Kong is an example of counter-revolution. It's a huge, really extremely serious attack on basic democratic rights, the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, political association. It has extremely wide-ranging implications, and it's something, of course, that socialists and all those who stand for genuine democratic rights are implacably opposed to and urge resistance to. But the reason why it's happened now at this particular juncture is because really what's happening on the other side of the border, it's the crisis in China itself. Unemployment, the real unemployment figure, because the official unemployment figures are manipulated, you can't trust them. The real level is around 20% at the present time. And at the same time, you've then got this intensified Cold War between the Chinese regime and the US, and increasingly most other Western governments. You have this really severe escalation of the crisis on a global scale that has taken place, and is not likely to abate in the next few months. We've said that this Cold War, this is not a temporary phenomenon. It's not just some kind of feature of Trump's politic. It doesn't really matter who wins the presidential election in November. And ironically, the Communist Party dictatorship in China prefers Trump to win the election in the US, because despite the fact that Trump has caused them all kinds of problems in the course of the last 3.5 years, they've actually been able to extract certain concessions and get certain deals from Trump. They would say that he's a transactional president rather than an ideological president, and they're more worried about the Democrats from the point of view that they think they could reduce some of the tensions with the other Western powers, and they could be more effective in building a coalition against China as part of this grand inter-imperialist conflict that's taking place at the present time. So we're talking about crisis on the home front, and we're talking about crisis on a global scale for the Chinese regime, and therefore they felt that they needed to demonstrate strength, that they needed to demonstrate resolve and show that in Hong Kong, they're in control, they're the bosses, they're going to make the decisions, and therefore it was a very, very much a demonstrative act in order to, if you like, to show the power of the Chinese regime. And the other point that I would say is that this is particularly linked to Xi Jinping's personal position. This is a new kind of regime in China. It's not the same as the previous regimes, even of Xi Jinping's predecessor, because all power has been concentrated in his hands. He's the chairman of everything, as the expression goes. And he's been widely described as the most powerful leader in China since Mao Zedong. Well, we've never accepted, the ISA has always said that that's an exaggeration, that Xi Jinping's can't be compared to the position during the Mao years, and that in actual fact, his concentration of one-man dictatorship, of centralization of power, is an expression of incredible crisis within the regime, that they felt that if they didn't do this, the Communist Party regime itself was threatened, that its existence was on the line. And I think that that's part also of what's happening now, because what we've seen since the pandemic erupted in the beginning of the year and the global crisis is that the power struggle within the CCP, this is an extremely factionized political organism. The CCP, throughout its history, has had all kinds of fierce faction fighting, and that faction fight has very much taken off again in the last few months. Splits at the top, which are an indication that revolutionary tremors are on their way on the ground. So it's because of this that Xi Jinping also felt that he was required to do something quite powerful, make quite a powerful gesture in relation to Hong Kong, also to warn his rivals within the CCP dictatorship to back off and not to challenge his power.
Thank you so much for that background, Vincent. It's super important for us to be able to fully analyze the situation and what is going on to understand the lead up and what has brought us to the situation. Earlier, we talked to Pasha about specifically what this new law is going to do. So let's watch a video of the explanation of this new law.
Hello, comrades. The situation in Hong Kong is very critical. I'm sure you have read from the news that the new national security law has been implemented in Hong Kong on June the 30th. The details of the law was just announced 1 hour before midnight in order to maximize the shock and fear on 1st of July, which has been a traditional day for very huge demonstrations in Hong Kong. This draconian law is a game changer in the situation of Hong Kong. The effect is similar to a military coup or crackdown. Democratic rights that existed last week, such as freedom of association, freedom of speech, are now hanging by a thread. The law marks the end of one country, two systems, which gave Hong Kong partial political autonomy. Now it is the dictatorship's secret police and security agents who are in control. I will first briefly explain what the law is about. The law targets four main crimes: secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. The provisions are written deliberately in a vague way with very heavy punishment, from 10 years of imprisonment to up to life imprisonment. For instance, the definition of terrorism is exceptionally broad. Even so-called serious interruption of public transport is considered terrorism. That means even workers going on strike, forming picket lines that blocks traffic, could be seen as terrorism and face life imprisonment. For subversion, you can't call for another government in China. That is now illegal. You can't say down with the CCP dictatorship, or even down with the one-party rule, which has always been one of the core demands of the democratic movement. Secession not only refers to Hong Kong independence, but also calls for self-determination, and is also applicable to Taiwan, Tibet, or Xinjiang. And you are equally guilty even if you are not using force or threaten to use force according to law. That is, even if you are just peacefully showing solidarity with these issues, you can go to jail. By this law, even Mao Zedong would go to jail because in the 1930s and 40s, before CCP came to power, he wrote articles supporting the right of self-determination for various nations in China. And the slogan, "Reclaim Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times," which was one of the most popular protest slogans, is now banned under the new law on the grounds that reclaiming means secession. We Socialists never supported this slogan because it is associated with Hong Kong right-wing nativists and point in a confused way that turn away from forming a united movement with mainland Chinese workers. But then, by banning the slogan, the CCP has guaranteed that the slogan will become more popular. Finally, colluding with foreign forces can mean anything from lobbying foreign right-wing governments to organizing international working-class solidarity, including ISA. In fact, Lenin's Communist International, which the CCP was once a member of, will be banned today by the CCP. When 80 young left-wing activists in China were arrested and disappeared in 2018 for campaigning for an independent workers' union in the famous JCIC struggle, they were accused of colluding with foreign forces. This is the textbook accusation of the Chinese state against any groups that want to crack down on. What is important isn't what the actual law says, but in fact who is enforcing the law. Together with the national security law comes a new National Security Office in Hong Kong, which is basically a Gestapo, and they will have powers that override all local courts and laws. In the past, mainland agents had operated in Hong Kong, but in secrecy, such as in the infamous kidnapping of the booksellers in 2015. But now they can operate freely under broad daylight without any restrictions and have unlimited power. What is worse, the government is adding new rules day by day. Just a few days after the implementation of the law, they announced that foreign organizations, including those in Taiwan, must surrender their membership list and bank account details to the government. If they refuse, their members, regardless of their nationality, could be arrested if they ever set foot in Hong Kong. The law is written in a way that it is extraterritorial. It is applicable to everyone around the world, Hong Kongers, Chinese, foreigners, even if you do it outside of China or Hong Kong. That is, if you have ever protested the Chinese government or supported Taiwan independence, you could be potentially arrested if you ever set foot in China or Hong Kong. Therefore, we urge you not to visit China or Hong Kong, even for traveling or transit, as long as CCP is in power. And then on the next day, they announced that the police can do house searches, workplace searches, wiretapping without a warrant. They also can block anyone under investigation from leaving Hong Kong. Internet and telecom services providers must provide their user details to the state forces. Police are basically given unlimited powers. Then on the next day again, they announced that sensitive books will be banned from schools and public libraries. Police have started taking DNA swabs from arrested protesters. This is without their consent, even if they are not charged with any crime yet. Previously, this was only allowed if you were suspected for a very serious crime. It is as if they are in such a rush to pass the law that they have not actually thought out the details, than that they are making things up as the days go by. Basically, they can do whatever they want now. The law is much more draconian than most commentators expected. Now it is basically direct rule by Beijing, and that the Hong Kong government is completely powerless. It is like an applause track on a TV show, clapping and cheering whatever the CCP decides to do. The law is a serious setback for the democracy struggle in Hong Kong, but it may not be as long-lasting as the CCP dictatorship hope. They have gone for a shock and awe effect to spread fear and terror, but their real support gets smaller and smaller. The capitalist elite in Hong Kong, who all supports Xi Jinping's takeover of Hong Kong, and the pro-CCP political parties are more and more hated. In last year's district council elections, these parties were smashed. The opposition, broadly defined as pro-democracy and anti-CCP, won 87% of the seats. These are powerless councils, so it was really more like an opinion poll than a meaningful election. But it still shows that CCP rule rests on very weak ground. And then there is mainland China. Actually, Xi Jinping did not need to use the nuclear option of the national security law in Hong Kong. It isn't really about Hong Kong, but something much bigger. The crackdown in Hong Kong is partly to scare the Chinese masses, and especially the working class, who are growing more and more discontented because of the economic collapse taking place, with around 80 million workers unemployed now. Xi's actions are also aimed at projecting an image of strength and ruthlessness to show the US and the West that he means business. But this is mainly because there is a fierce faction struggle going on within the dictatorship. Xi Jinping needs to show a strong hand, whether in Hong Kong or on the border conflict with India, hoping that this will re-establish his control over the CCP state. 2020 has been a very dangerous year for him and for the dictatorship. They fear mass upheavals in China. For socialists, what has happened in Hong Kong shows that we are in a new historical period of explosive changes, unprecedented crisis. Hong Kong today is an example of counter-revolution, and we understand that, but there are also revolutionary features. Therefore, the dictator and the capitalists have every reason to be worried. The situation in Hong Kong is very critical.
Thanks so much, Pasha, for that explanation of what is going on. I found it super helpful, and I encourage people to share that with their coworkers and their friends if they're wondering specifically what is going on in China and Hong Kong right now. But Vincent, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what Pasha said and about this new law.
Yeah, well, I think one of the key things that Pasha's just said is that the law being imposed now is about something much bigger than just what's happening in Hong Kong. The movement in Hong Kong, which was an incredible movement last year, was already really going down. It had run up against its own contradictions, above all because of the fact that it was not based on mass organization, particularly working class organization. It was a spontaneous movement. That's fine for starting a protest movement, but it's not enough to sustain the movement for months and months, and particularly up against such a pernicious and powerful regime as the Chinese dictatorship. And therefore, in a certain sense, the law at this stage is overkill from the point of view of Hong Kong, but it's been done with a different audience in mind. In Chinese, you have the expression, killing the chicken to scare the monkey. And Hong Kong is the chicken that's being slaughtered now to put the fear of the regime into another audience. And that's partly international capitalism. It's the governments that the Chinese regime is increasingly having all kinds of disputes with. And it's also the mainland China masses themselves, particularly the working class, that the regime is using this draconian act to try to basically deter and strike terror into the minds of workers in China, dissidents in China, feminists, all the varieties of underground dissent, if you like, to say you should not challenge the Chinese regime. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Now we're going to go to Jacko to talk a little bit about the uprising that happened last year. People may remember we saw millions and millions of people hitting the streets, really inspiring people around the world. So let's go to Jacko to hear about that.
Last year, Hong Kong was changed forever by an unprecedented mass movement demanding an end to repression and for basic democratic rights. This movement shocked the Chinese dictatorship and Hong Kong's capitalist establishment. The new national security law has been imposed by China, showing that the dictatorship is becoming quite desperate. The CCP, so-called Communist Party, is afraid the movement in Hong Kong could spill over into China, sparking an even bigger mass movement against repression and against dictatorship. So actually, while the national security law is written for Hong Kong, the dictatorship is really sending a message to the masses in China, as well as to the US and other rival imperialist power. The dictatorship wants to show strength to spread fear. The movement in Hong Kong that began on June 9th was extremely powerful and huge. It lasted for more than half a year, with up to 2 million people joining demonstrations. Over 9,000 were arrested, 2,500 injured. The police repression was very brutal. Over 16,000 tear gas rounds were used and 10,000 rubber bullets. The movement was extremely young. 30% of arrested protesters were under 18. The protesters have a very strong sense that the fight against CCP dictatorship is the final battle, that the limited democratic rights that have existed in Hong Kong for 3 or 4 decades will be lost unless people join this fight. The movement in Hong Kong inspired protesters around the world during last year's protests in many countries and also this year's in the US in the mass anti-racist protests against police violence. Many protesters copied some of the methods of Hong Kong youth, such as using umbrellas against pepper spray. The tactic of to be water was also discussed widely in the US protests. Mass spontaneity at the start of the Hong Kong struggle, like in the US now, was a very positive factor. In Hong Kong, it means the old compromise politicians, the traditional bourgeois pan-democratic opposition, they were left behind by the movement. In the past, these politicians have demobilized other mass movements because they actually don't think mass struggle is helpful. They feared it will provoke the regime and will get out of control. So this incredible movement began in a spontaneous and unorganized way. But then it becomes more complicated. A loose, unorganized movement is not enough to complete a struggle to get a victory. For that, you need organization and real leadership. It should be democratic organization with mass meetings and democratic structures, and it should be elected representatives that have earned people's confidence in the struggle. The need for an organized movement is especially decisive when the issue is not about winning something partial like higher wages, or stopping a new road of construction project, but about the power of the regime. Democratic rights, even the limited rights that have existed in Hong Kong up to now, are seen as a threat to the existence of the CCP. In Hong Kong, there is a strong mood against any political parties and organizations. Because of the experience of being betrayed by the Liberal Democrats, the protesters think all parties and leaders will betray and hijack the movement. Without any mass organizations, the movement became separated between a huge layer who supported the struggle but were not directly involved on a day-to-day basis, and the younger, more militant layer who wanted a day-to-day active resistance. These protesters adopted a more anarchistic methods of black blocs and mainly focused on confronting the police on the streets. Polls showed that 60% and at times 80% of the population support the protests. However, with these methods, it was not possible to sustain the movement and to show a way to win. The movement is now going down because of heavy police repression. One of the biggest problems in Hong Kong has been the weak role of the trade unions for many decades. In every mass struggle to achieve democratic rights, the mass workers' organizations have played the decisive and the leading role. That was the case in South Korea, Brazil, South Africa in 1970s and 1980s. This is what Marxists have always pointed out. Actually, it is an aspect of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. The capitalists no longer want to or can fight for their tasks, such as establishing bourgeois democracy. The working class needs to do this, but of course the working class should not stop at winning democratic rights and abolishing totalitarian rule, but should continue its revolution to achieve socialism. A study by Norwegian historians, which was reported in the Washington Post, actually confirms what Marxists say. They studied mass movement in 150 different countries over the whole 20th century. This is what they found. Industrial workers have been key agents of democratization and, if anything, are even more important than the urban middle classes. While industrial workers mobilize mass opposition against a dictatorship, democratization is very likely to follow. Real unions hardly exist in Hong Kong. There's a pro-US liberal union called Confederation of Trade Unions, CTU, and another pro-Beijing Federation of Trade Unions, FTU. FTU supports the national security law and the dictatorship, and they were against strike actions. CTU supports the movement in general, but never tries to have a real mobilization. Since the movement last year, there's an increased consciousness about the need for strike and organizing unions. It is the first time for 90 years in Hong Kong that a mass call for general strike has been heard. However, due to the absence of trade unions traditions in Hong Kong, the idea of strike action was interpreted as youth protesters blocking traffic or roads in order to stop people from going to work. There was a wave of new unions formed at the end of last year. However, unfortunately at this stage, these unions are not real working class organizations. In many cases, the union leaders are managers or even bosses of small companies. The union leaders have been against building up a force in workplaces because they think it is impossible. But if you only have virtual unions, then you will only get a virtual strike, not a real strike. Now in May, after the national security law was announced by China, there was an attempt to mobilize strike action with a referendum. But then the referendum failed. Also, mistakes were made. The referendum was not a good tactic before real union structures exist. And some of the new unions had a very unrealistic expectation of how many would vote. Unfortunately, now strike action is seen as something difficult. It has undermined this idea, which is still one of the keys to build a successful mass struggle. So the unions and Pan-Democrats called for a one-day political strike, but it was just a press release statement without real mobilization. Unfortunately, this is still an idea for the future. As the mass movement is going down, there's a strong desperate mood to put hope in the US and other imperialist governments. The liberals and far-right Hong Kong nationalists support Trump and the US government against China in the Cold War. The US and other capitalists are of course hypocritical. For decades, they toned down any criticism of human rights and repression in China. They secretly make deals with the CCP even after Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. John Bolton's new book even shows that Trump promised Xi Jinping his support for the concentration camp in the Muslim Xinjiang region. Trump told Xi it was the correct thing to do. But now, due to the escalating China-US conflict, US imperialism wants to block China to decouple from China's economy and punish the CCP for COVID-19. So the US and governments like British Tories disguise this geopolitical battle against China by using democracy and human rights issues. It is possible now the US and other Western governments will impose more sanctions and financial retaliation against China over the national security law. Xi Jinping may have made a serious miscalculation. He may have mistaken Trump's lack of interest in Hong Kong as a sign that the US response will be very soft. But the US cannot afford to show weakness on these issues, or that will mark a historic defeat. A global power shift with America falling to number 2. However, the only way to defend democratic rights and defeat authoritarian rule is mass struggle, especially through strong working class organizations. The illusions in the US have not strengthened the Hong Kong movement, but actually helped to demobilize. Looking for an outside savior to governments that themselves use police repression against protests and serve capitalist power interests. That is looking for the wrong way. Instead of building democratic organizations, mass organization, and aiming to link up with Chinese workers and workers around the world. And that's why we need a mass working class party with a socialist program in order to defeat capitalism and the dictatorship.
Thanks so much, Jacko. And it is so true what he said, that the movement in Hong Kong really inspired people globally, whether it was through tactics or the fact that they were out every day for months and months. Vincent, can you speak a little bit about what Jacko was talking about?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to overstate the significance of the mass struggle in Hong Kong that began in June last year. That it's a movement that really set an entirely new bar in terms of determination, endurance, and the heroism of particularly the young protesters who were taking on the world's most powerful authoritarian state. The Guardian newspaper said that it was the biggest per capita movement in global history, because with up to 2 million people on the streets on some of the demonstrations, that probably 1 in 3 of the population marched last year in the protests against the extradition law. But the crucial ingredient, as Jacko touched upon now, that was missing in this process is the question of distinct workers' organizations and mass organization of the struggle, which really is a legacy of the weakness of trade unionism and of working class politics in Hong Kong over an entire historical period. And that meant that while the movement was predominantly working class in terms of its participation, if you look at a breakdown of those arrested, particularly the young people arrested by the police, over 9,000, as I think Jacko said, then you'll find that there's a very big proportion who are working class youth from blue collar families or young workers in sectors such as delivery workers, retail workers, transport workers, and so on. But unfortunately lacking their own distinct organizations, and a workers' party with a clear anti-capitalist socialist message, which we think is crucial. No left or socialist organization worth its salt can refuse to support the struggle for democratic rights in Hong Kong and in China. We've never, in ISA, we've never argued the case that Hong Kong is a special case or it should get special privileges. We've said that the struggle is for democratic rights in Hong Kong and China. And this is an extremely important point, because Hong Kong, the struggle has also shown that you can't defeat a regime that is as powerful, the second most powerful military power in the world, just based on a struggle in one city. And they have to appeal to the masses in mainland China to also join the struggle and fight against the authoritarian regime. I just want to make a point about who's really supporting these attacks on democracy, because firstly, you know, it's a very common narrative to say that the US is supporting the Hong Kong protesters, other Western governments are supporting Hong Kong protesters. This is just an imperialist maneuver to undermine the Chinese regime for geopolitical reasons. And there's an element of that, there's no question about it. But we have to remember that the US and the other Western governments did not say anything against what China was doing, its repressive policies, up until just a few years ago. That going back over 30 or 40 years, the US has closely encouraged the Chinese regime because it saw it carrying out pro-capitalist policies, welcoming multinationals, and the Chinese dictatorship was seen as absolutely crucial as a regime that could hold down the working class, deny them trade union rights, dragoon them into sweatshops that would allow the multinationals, including US companies, to make super profits out of China. So they said nothing whatsoever. You had a whole period, a whole number of presidents who went to China, Bush, Obama, they said nothing about human rights. They were as meek as anything. When they were questioned, did you raise human rights? They said, well, we took it up in private. We took it up privately with the Chinese leader. And that's changed dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years in particular, not because the Western governments have suddenly decided that, you know, they've got a democratic conscience, they've got a conscience about all this repression after all, but purely to serve their geopolitical interests, which mean that they are now on a collision course with the Chinese regime rather than supporting it. I think that this is very, very important to realize.
Thank you, Vincent. You gave us a lot to work with there. And I know we have some questions and comments about, you know, the need to unite the movement with the Chinese working class as well, which we hopefully will have time to get to. I want to ask Vincent a specific question, changing gears just a little bit. It sounds a bit like this crackdown is a show of strength, which covers up real weakness. But the international media often paints China as the power which is, you know, getting ahead of the rest in the context of things like the pandemic and the economic crisis. Can you tell us what's the reality like?
Yes, I think that there is a misleading picture that's generally widespread in the world at large, and even it's even misunderstood widely, I think, on the left and amongst left organizations. The idea, which is indisputable, that the US is, of course, a decline in power. The US has been severely weakened economically, politically, and that process has accelerated under Trump's presidency, which has been an unmitigated disaster from the standpoint of US capitalism. But the idea then that China is running on full power and is rising rapidly, and I think that the reality of the situation is a lot more nuanced than that. That the Chinese dictatorship is encountering huge problems. There are around 80 million. I think that was the figure that was given by Pasha. 80 million are unemployed at the present time in China. There is tens of millions of migrant workers. And when we talk about migrants in China, these are not foreign workers from overseas. These are the workers from the poorer provinces of China. These are internal migrants. And under the hukou system, the household registration system, which is a kind of an internal apartheid in China. When you're born, you're given documentation, you're given registration papers, which either designate you as an urban resident or as a rural resident. And you can't change that. It's very difficult to ever change your designation. So you're born rural, you will die rural. And the majority of this 300 million strong workforce, the migrant workforce in China, they're rural workers from the poorest regions that go to work in the industrial zones, in the factories, on the construction sites and so on. The Chinese economic miracle of the last 30 years was built by the blood, sweat and toil of the migrant laborers. And now millions of them, tens of millions, have gone back to the farms because there are no jobs in the industrial zones. And therefore, if you like, the unemployment benefit that exists in China, because there is no unemployment insurance for the migrant workers and very little even for the urban workforce, only of the urban workforce, only around 1 in 10 get any kind of dole money or unemployment insurance. The migrant workers get nothing. So the unemployment insurance is to go back to the farm and try to survive on agriculture until things turn up for the better. And so this is really, the unemployment problem now is the major problem facing the Chinese regime. This is why at the National People's Congress, which took place in May, they refused for the first time to adopt a GDP target. They're very evasive about what they believe the GDP will be this year. The IMF says that China will achieve 1% GDP growth. The Chinese regime may produce other figures at the end of the year, but we have to be on guard for the fact these figures could be manipulated, because that's the tradition. You can't believe most of the figures that are coming out of the Statistics Bureau in China. Li Keqiang, the premier, the number 2 in the Chinese regime, he made an extremely important speech at the end of the National People's Congress. He dropped a bombshell. He said 600 million Chinese are living on less than $140 per month, 40% of the population. Now, I say this was a bombshell because, firstly, the Chinese regime, since the beginning of the year, since COVID-19 erupted, they've been insisting on positive news, that you shouldn't spread anything negative about what's happening in China. Well, this was very negative news coming from the second most powerful official within the regime. The reality is that the living standards for the masses in China, for the mass of the working class, are actually falling, and they've been falling for some time, 2, maybe 3 years. That the increased cost of housing, of healthcare, of schools, because none of that is free. It used to be in the old days of the Maoist, Stalinist planned economy. You had free healthcare, you had free schooling, but all that's gone. It's all been marketized. Schooling and healthcare are extremely expensive, and they're one of the main reasons why so many households in China have gone into debt. And this is the social situation which the Chinese regime finds itself in at the present time. Wage cuts on the order of 50% have taken place in the industrial zones this year. So despite the fact that the GDP data is saying that the Chinese economy is getting back to full steam, and they're producing statistics to show that there's 95% or 97% resumption of production, in reality, this does not tell us what is actually happening in the economy, that rather than a V-shaped recovery, there is nowhere for them to sell these goods. They can't sell them overseas because the export markets are drying up, again, because of the pandemic and the crisis, and also now because of the decoupling, which is part of the global Cold War that's taking place, where they want to separate their economies more and more from China. And the internal demand is not powerful enough to compensate for this loss of export markets. So you've got a situation really where the Chinese economy is heading into unprecedented crisis. The first recession, which is what it will be in reality, for 40 years, something which most Chinese have never encountered in their life. So we're heading into very, very stormy waters as far as the Chinese economy and Chinese society is concerned. And this is why, as I mentioned before, these splits are now developing within the CCP regime, which are extremely significant. I mentioned the Premier, Li Keqiang. His speech about the 600 million living on just 140 US dollars, this speech actually was a veiled attack on Xi Jinping's position. So what you've got is a split opening up, a factional struggle between the two most senior figures within the regime. And this is something we haven't seen in 7 years of Xi Jinping's rule. We were told that he'd basically clamped down and the power struggle was over. Well, it's back with a vengeance in 2020. And this is something that is going to be extremely important as we go forward.
Thank you, Vincent. Now, before we go to comments from the audience and questions from the audience, I want to ask about the tensions between China and the US. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, this is really the most central feature now of world politics, is the conflict between the two most powerful imperialist regimes. And it is a Cold War. And it's escalated dramatically in the course of the COVID-19 crisis. You've had Trump denouncing China, saying that what they've done is worse than the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's worse than 9/11. You've had China giving as good as it gets, hitting back with its attacks on the US, its verbal attacks. You have the phenomena of what's called wolf warrior diplomacy. The Chinese diplomatic corps, the foreign ministry spokespeople, they're described as the wolf warrior diplomats. It's a Chinese movie. It's actually two movies that were the best grossing movies in China. They're kind of a Chinese equivalent of Rambo. Chinese soldiers take on warlords and American mercenaries and defeat them in an African country. And this is the nickname now for the new generation of diplomats who have dispensed with any of the tact, any of the caution of the past, and are launching wholesale attacks, not just on the US, but on other countries. And this is a new feature. This has really not been seen before this year, not on the scale. So basically, you've got the Xi Jinping's regime are they're picking fights left, right, and centre with all of their opponents. You have the border conflict with India, and this is the most serious conflict since the 1962 war between the two countries, where 20 Indian soldiers were killed last month, and an unknown number of Chinese soldiers were killed because they haven't released the figures. But there are unconfirmed reports quoted in Indian media of around 40 Chinese casualties, not necessarily fatalities. And this war is between two warmongering, nationalist, right-wing governments, Xi Jinping's government and the Modi government in India, that are fighting not just because of the significance of the border in the Himalayan region, but really to show their power and to demonstrate that they are not going to be pushed around. It's really also part and parcel of the same messaging that we're seeing with the Hong Kong national security law. It's to demonstrate Chinese imperialism's power and that it will not be messed with. You have what happened with Australia now. Now that's very significant. Australia is one of the countries which is most dependent on the Chinese market for its exports. 30% of China's trade goes to, 30% of Australia's trade goes to China. Despite that, you have a very severe, very sharp breakdown in relations between the two governments, where the Australian government earlier this year called for an investigation, basically supporting and echoing the demands of the Trump administration for an independent investigation into how COVID started and into the role of the Chinese government. And the Chinese government immediately retaliated by imposing import restrictions on Australian barley and on Australian beef, and threatening that they could do more than that. The Chinese government warned the Chinese students, and there are tens of thousands studying in Australia, warned them that Australia was now no longer safe and that Chinese students should not choose Australia as a designation for their university education. It's a very, very sharp conflict between the two countries. Now, in 2014, Xi Jinping made a state visit to Australia, and he spoke in the Australian Parliament, and he was given a standing ovation by all the parties in the Australian Parliament. And that shows, by the way, what I referred to earlier, that this phenomena of Western powers mentioning human rights, mentioning the atrocities in Xinjiang, mentioning what's going on in Hong Kong is a very new phenomena. It's only really started in the last 2 or 3 years. And it's, as Jacko said, it's being used as a disguise for what are geopolitical ambitions of the Western countries and also their economic power. They want to decouple from the Chinese economy, at least partially to decouple, because the pandemic has really shown in a very, very shocking way how dependent their economies have become on the Chinese economy, and they no longer trust that government, they no longer trust the CCP's economic management, and they're having to look to diversify and to basically to cut down their exposure to China and to Chinese production markets. I mentioned Australia, I mentioned India, there are many more. There's the conflict with Canada, where the Canadian government has refused to allow Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the owner of Huawei, the tech company, China's biggest tech company, the company which is at the eye of the storm of the new tech war between Western countries and China over the 5G systems. Meng was detained and put in house arrest in Canada a year and a half ago, and she's facing extradition to stand trial in the US for money laundering and sanction busting charges. And China then arrested 2 Canadians, the 2 Michaels, Michael Spobrig, Michael Spavor, who are now, just a couple of weeks ago, have been charged with espionage, which means that they could face the death penalty. And then a letter was recently written and an intervention from China to the Canadian government, again asking them to do a deal. The Chinese regime has always denied that the 2 Michaels were being held as any kind of hostage or tit-for-tat negotiation with Canada over the Meng detention. And by the way, Meng Wanzhou is living in a mansion in Vancouver. She's got an ankle, what do you call it, a bracelet on her, you know, to ensure that she doesn't break curfew, but she lives in relatively, you could say, 5-star conditions, whereas we can guess that the 2 Canadians being held in China are living in far from luxurious conditions. But the situation is that the Chinese regime admitted that actually they were prepared to do a deal and release the 2 Michaels in return for the release of Meng. This has led to an unprecedented drop in relations between Canada and China. The same thing is being repeated everywhere. In the South China Sea, the Philippines government, which under the President Duterte made a very sharp pro-China turn a few years back in its foreign policy, in its economic policy, the Filipino government now is beginning to tilt back towards the US camp and is actually involved in quite a sharp exchange of words with the Chinese side over what's happening in the South China Sea, where both the Philippines and China lay claim to disputed islands and disputed waters. So in other words, what's going on, the Chinese wolf warrior diplomats are lighting fires everywhere. Basically they're in conflict with governments in Asia, in Europe, the US, and even in Africa, where recently Xi Jinping and the government met with African leaders to discuss the Belt and Road Initiative, China's infrastructure program, where the African governments pleaded for debt forgiveness because of COVID, because of the economic crisis. And the Chinese side said, we're not in a position to give you the debt forgiveness, so you better sink the level of your ambitions on that. And this is creating tensions also with African governments that up until this year have been relatively warm relations with the Chinese government. Now, we're not saying, of course, that this is all China's fault and that the other governments somehow are the innocent victims. On the contrary, this is a conflict between different capitalist classes and different imperialist powers, where they're all defending their own interests at the expense, of course, of working people, at the expense of the climate, at the expense, really, of the planet. But nevertheless, for a Chinese regime that's in such a difficult situation, one would have thought that the smartest thing to do would be to tone it down. Instead of adopting a diplomatic approach, which has been compared to the Millwall football supporters chant, football, soccer, the Millwall supporters, they chant, "No one likes us and we don't care." And that's almost become the motif of the Chinese regime's diplomacy in the last period. And it's actually it's insane from the standpoint of their needs right now, which would be for a more cautious, a more low-key approach to try to diffuse some of these conflicts. But again, this is tied to the power struggle. And it's not possible to really understand what's going on in China unless you understand this higher level, extremely sharp power struggle in the regime. Xi Jinping is the one who has this hardline, nationalist, militarist agenda. And he is trying to demonstrate to the other factions in the CCP that he is not going to make concessions, that he is not going to bend or change his approach. And there are those other factions, including some of the powerful princelings within the Chinese regime, who were big players, big capitalist families within the Chinese hierarchy, who are now increasingly discontented with what Xi Jinping is doing and believe that he's actually endangering their interests globally and in terms of China itself.
Thank you very much, Vincent. That was a lot, of information about all the imperialist powers. And one thing that I took from that, it just shows how the capitalist class will use what's advantageous to them at the moment. They will criticize when it's advantageous to them at the moment. And it shows the need to fight against capitalism and this type of oppression in order to truly liberate the working class and have working class candidates, working class parties, things of that nature. We don't have much time, but I do want to get to one question because we have a lot of socialists and activists watching our show here today. And so this question is from Yara in England, and they ask, what can socialists and activists around the world do to support the activists in Hong Kong and China against these draconian laws? What would you say to Yara as something that socialists around the world can do to help?
Yeah, well, this is very important. And I think there is a lot that can be done. And I think that solidarity with the youth in Hong Kong, but with the youth and workers in China, we never separate the two, because the struggles can't be separated. If you separate them, then they will not succeed. They're fighting and their interests are the same. So the struggle for democratic rights, the struggle against capitalist exploitation in both Hong Kong and China, it has to be linked together, and solidarity is needed. Now, if you look at who's supporting the national security law, the big capitalists in Hong Kong are all on board. There's not a single major capitalist company in Hong Kong which has not said that it supports the national security law, and that includes foreign companies. The 9 richest billionaires in Hong Kong, who have a combined wealth of 140 billion US dollars, they all signed public declarations before the law was passed saying that they supported the national security law. HSBC, which is the world's 6th largest bank, it's based in the UK. It's also got huge operations in Hong Kong and China. It's on its website. It's publicly stating that it supports the national security law, welcomes the national security law, that it will bring stability and prosperity to Hong Kong. HSBC's Asia CEO is a delegate to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Committee, the body which in May, along with the NPC, voted for and imposed the national security law. So these companies are not just bystanders or observers, they're actively involved in implementing this law. So the first thing that tells you is the capitalists are behind the repression. They're supporting the crackdown. They're supporting the attack on democratic rights. So those who say that this is somehow a reactionary movement in Hong Kong because it's against the Communist Party's dictatorship in China, they're completely wrong. They haven't understood who's on what side in the conflict. So that's the first thing. But it also means that solidarity action could take a number of forms, including picketing and protesting at some of these companies because they have huge operations and a huge footprint in the West as well. HSBC has branches basically all around the world. And it has, of course, branches in every town and city in the UK. HSBC, we had a campaign against them last year, ISA, because the HSBC in Hong Kong dismissed one of our Hong Kong comrades because of his trade union activism and because he was campaigning for a strike. Li Ka-shing, whose company is called Hutchison, he's a big Hong Kong billionaire tycoon. He is the biggest foreign investor in the UK. He owns retail companies like Superdrug. His company owns the Green King hotel and pub chain with more than 2,000 outlets across the whole of the UK. But he also is a big investor in the rail sector. I think it's 1/3 of the rail companies in the UK are owned by the rail systems are owned by Li Ka-shing's company. It's the biggest operator in the mobile phone market in the UK. So I think that we can focus on the capitalists who are supporting this repression, and we can target and protest outside their companies, and we can approach the trade unions at these companies in the West, because that would also not just raise the issue of Hong Kong and China and the struggle that's going on there, but it will also educate about the importance of working class solidarity and the fact that we need to fight the capitalists, that we need to fight what they're doing, which of course is being a prime mover of the repression and of the authoritarian system in Hong Kong and China.
Thanks so much, Vincent. And yeah, I totally agree how important it is to really connect the working classes across the globe, especially considering what's going on in Hong Kong and China. And protesting outside of these major capitalist corporations and entities is a great way to start that process. I want to thank you so much, Vincent, for coming with us today. And if you want to learn more about the situation in Hong Kong and China, you can check out the International Socialist Alternative website, where we have articles written about it. So for the last section of our show, we're going to do our shout out of the week. And so this week, drum roll, we are shouting out Seattle with the tax Amazon victory. Socialist Alternative in Seattle has been fighting since 2018 to put a progressive tax on the massive corporations that are headquartered in the city. The state of Washington, where Seattle is, has no personal income tax, so it's a hot spot for the world's billionaires to reside. And so there's massive amounts of wealth that's hoarded there, while working class people are constantly being pushed out of the city centers. The homeless population is rising. The cost of living is making it nearly impossible for people to get by. And so Socialist Alternative and Council Member Shama Sawant fought tooth and nail to win what we called the Amazon tax, although it doesn't just tax Amazon. And we won this through a grassroots organizing. And even the state tried to stop this question from landing on the ballot in November by making online signatures not accepted. And let's think of the context that we're in. It's a global pandemic. And so this made organizing around this issue quite difficult. So through all of that, 30,000 signatures were still collected, which forced the city council to reluctantly vote in favor of an Amazon tax that will generate upwards of $240 million yearly to fund things like affordable housing and other programs that the city needs. I want to end talking about this with a quote from Socialist Alternative City Councilwoman Shama Sawant describing the victory. She said, "The Amazon tax is perhaps the most important progressive victory in Seattle since socialists and labor unions led the way on the $15 minimum wage movement in 2014. Which passed first here and then was won in cities and states around the country. We hope that once again we can inspire working people and youth nationally and globally to spread this victory to other cities and regions, and we will do everything in our power to assist in this crucial fight against the billionaire class that is attempting to force working people to pay for the current crisis of capitalism. No to austerity under this pandemic and recession. Tax big business, not working people." This is the type of work that we in Socialist Alternative and the International Socialist Alternative do every day. And if you're watching this and you agree with our analysis, please consider donating to our organization. We have a goal right now of raising $90,000 to help spread the work and resources of our organization globally. So if you can help, whether it's $5, $200, $1,000, whatever it is, to help spread this movement, that would be amazing. Next week, unfortunately, I know you're going to miss me. We're taking the day off for the virtual Marxist University, which is going to be a fantastic event. But tune in 2 weeks' time, where we'll be back at it with an exciting episode. Thanks for watching. See you then.